Hey everyone, I'm Supersonic7C, and welcome to Syntax Error, the show where I analyze topics that relate to game design and try to teach viewers how to develop their games. Today I'll be talking about how to plan a video game and the pre-production phase, which is the first stage of game development. In this phase, developers need to complete multiple tasks, like finalizing their game's concept, creating a playable prototype, and most importantly, planning how they'll actually make their game. Some developers feel planning out their game is unnecessary or not worth the hassle, so they decide to just wing it and make up their game as they go along. But I highly advise against this. Not only will planning ahead help developers keep track of what they're working on, it'll also help stories have better flow and make your lines of code more organized, which will help the game run smoother. Although, in the end those devs are right about one thing: planning a game can be something of a hassle, so much so that some developers don't even know where or how to start planning their game. This stumped me for a while as well, so I decided to try and create a list of steps developers can take, or at least refer to, in order to plan their game. Normally it's impossible for me to give a step-by-step tutorial in this show thanks to all games being so wildly different, but this is one of the few exceptions. So what I'm saying is, don't get used to these types of episodes. Before I actually start describing the steps, I should mention that this video is mostly meant for developers planning a brand new game that equally focuses on all elements that make up the game, like audio, visuals, gameplay, and story. If you're planning a sequel or certain types of games, like walking simulators, episodic games, or games with a large focus on player choice, some of this advice or these steps may not adhere to you. I'll make sure to talk about how to plan these types of games whenever I create an episode solely focused on them. Until then, most of the steps and advice in this video should still help you plan your game, and I trust that you'll know what steps to cut or modify to accommodate your needs. The first step to creating any game is to devise an idea for said game, more specifically, an idea for the gameplay. Good ideas rarely just come to you unless you're looking for them in some way, so it's very important to spend some time brainstorming. In order to do this, think about what games you like, what genre of game you have fun making, and what type of game you could feasibly create. If you're having trouble thinking of ideas, play some of your favorite games, examine other forms of media, or even analyze games you think have room for improvement. You can also try taking inspiration from your own life and interests. Try to think about what you do for fun. After all, many games were originally inspired by what their creators did for fun as children. If you're still having trouble thinking of ideas, try doing something mundane. Boring tasks that allow your mind to wander, like taking a shower, going for a walk, cleaning your house, doodling at a piece of paper, starting your homework, or even just writing down your thoughts, can help you brainstorm. It sounds idiotic, but some of my best ideas have been thought up while laying in bed at night, standing around in the shower, or even just sitting on the toilet. Regardless of how you come up with your idea, once you have one, make sure you also brainstorm some aspects that'll help your game stand out. Although, try to avoid these aspects being simply cosmetic, and instead try to focus on gameplay mechanics, or at the very least story plot points that make your game feel unique. Now that you've come up with an idea, it's time to test it out and decide if you should expand on it by creating a gameplay prototype. This prototype should have extremely basic placeholder graphics and only include the core mechanics of the idea. As much as it kills me to say this, you shouldn't even worry about game design yet and solely focus on getting the prototype finished with the least amount of effort. Even if your game is going to be fairly complicated, this should only be a proof of concept that includes the basic mechanics. You can add a restart button to make testing easier, but other than that, don't include any mechanics that enhance the core gameplay. For example, a prototype or proof of concept for the game Portal would simply allow the player to move and use portals. There would be no fancy graphics, no puzzles, no cubes, no enemies, not even any failure states. There would only be the ability to mess around with the portal gun in an empty room. When you've created something like this, play around with it for at least 10 to 20 minutes, and spend that time determining if the core mechanics are engaging and if you can see yourself finding multiple creative ways to expand upon them. If you can't think of a decent amount of ideas, say at least 10, then chances are you need to go back to the drawing board and come up with a more flexible and interesting core mechanic. Once you've chosen an idea that you definitely want to expand on, start experimenting with the prototype you've created. I would do this by making a few test levels with some secondary gameplay mechanics that complement the core of the game. This will help you test your main mechanic even further, make sure you can feasibly create a game like this, and help you determine the scale of your game. Regardless of how much you experiment though, it should only take you about 1 or 2 weeks to get the prototype up and running and finish messing around with it. If you work a fair amount of hours per week and still can't meet this deadline, then you're probably doing something wrong. Assuming you don't spend too much time making graphics, polishing the prototype, or creating secondary mechanics, then it shouldn't be a problem for you to finish in 1 week, let alone 2. After making a few test levels, you need to decide how complicated your game can be by figuring out how much time you'll have to work on it and what your skill level will allow you to create. To do this, first ask yourself how much time you'll have to make the game before you'll get tied up doing something else, like continuing school or having to get a second job. Now take the maximum amount of time you'll have and subtract a third from it. If you somehow have a seemingly infinite amount of time on your hands, use the same equation, just look at it from a different angle. Determine what you want your game scale to be, then figure out how much time you'll need to make it without rushing, and then add 50% to the total time. Whether you be adding 50% or subtracting a third, you should always give yourself this extra time to complete the game and not base its scale on your maximum amount of available time. It may make the overall product smaller or less complex, but it'll also give you a safety net to fall into if something goes awry. This way, you won't get screwed and be forced to delay the game or abandon it indefinitely. Not only that, but you can use this extra time to plan and add bonus content to your game, like secrets, extra levels, or alternate game modes. Regardless of the type of game you're making, it should be possible for you to finish developing it without using this safety net if outside forces don't get in the way. So if you don't think you'll be able to complete it in time without rushing, your game idea is too ambitious and you need to scale it back. When you know for sure how much time you'll have to create your game, analyze your past experiences making games and use that information to estimate how much work you'll be able to get done before using your safety net. For example, if you previously worked on a similar game in the same genre as the one you're planning now, and it took you about a month to make each level, then best case scenario, you can create about 12 levels per year you work on the game. If you want to create more levels or make levels that differ in scale from the ones you made in the past, but you have a time limit, then you need to compensate by altering aspects and making them less time consuming. An example of this would be making less levels in order to make them all longer or more complicated. Of course, you may think it's possible to avoid compensating by rushing the game, but by doing this you're just compensating some of your game's quality for content, which I strongly advise against. After you've taken everything into account, you can decide on your game's scale. This is ultimately up to you. If you have a year to make a game and a safety net that's half a year long, feel free to make a game that'll only take you a few months to create. As long as your scale isn't too big or ambitious and you can get everything done on time without using your safety net, you should be fine. Now that you know the scale of your game and how long you'll have to develop it, it's time to continue working on the finer details by brainstorming ideas for the game's story. Feel free to follow the same brainstorming methods I detailed in the first step, just make sure you realize that the more complicated your story is, the more assets you'll have to create, the harder it will be to smoothly incorporate it all into the game, and the more time you'll have to spend on it in general. Also keep in mind everything you've done in the previous steps and think about what kind of story you want to create and what would fit well with the work you've already done. To brainstorm, ask yourself questions like these. When answering those questions, you may come up with an idea for an entire series of games, and that's fine, but I highly recommend to first focus on this game and make sure it stands on its own before even thinking about sequels. Although, if you do decide to make this game the first in a series, at least make sure to think about how you would connect this idea to the sequels before moving on to the next step. Once you've chosen an idea, you need to get to know the characters of your story. To do this, make a list of all the main and secondary characters in your game, conduct any necessary research for characters you may not know how to write, and then create a biography or character bible for each of them. In the bio, write down information like their full name, nicknames, likes, dislikes, goals, flaws, and all other information or character traits you deem noteworthy. Some examples of noteworthy information or character traits may include things like the character's backstory, religious affiliation, family relations, social status, place of birth, current place of living, age, race, gender, sexual preference, sexual identity, weight, height, or occupation. When you're done describing character traits, also write down how each character relates to the other characters and what their opinions of them are. I would also add some information about how each character changes from the beginning to the end of the story and what their character arc is, assuming they have one. When you've done all this, then you should draw some concept art or write down a description of their physical appearance. This will let you get a feel on how you want them to look and help when it's time to make graphics for the game. Next, you need to create a story outline, which is a quick and vague list of plot points in your game's narrative. If you haven't already, first you need to figure out the story's beginning and ending. Then decide what the climax of the story would be. Normally it's either a major turning point or the most intense part of the story. In most games, the climax is the final level or boss, but sometimes it's when the central plot twist is revealed. After that's decided, add in events that smoothly progress the plot from start to finish. This is where you add in all the rising actions which build up to the climax, and the falling actions which build down from the climax and lead into the end of the story and resolution of the main conflict. Usually there are multiple rising actions and only one or two falling actions, but all story structures are fine as long as they have good flow. Here's an example of a story structure. I would recommend creating one similar to this, but feel free to experiment and modify it as long as you don't ruin the story's pacing. If you're not planning the first game in a series, then you can continue to the next step. If you are, now's the time to make extremely rough outlines for each of the potential sequels. This way, it'll be easier to create a compelling overarching plot, while also foreshadowing and setting up future plot points in the first game. Just make sure to keep the events flexible, because you never know what you'll change later on. Because of this, I would only foreshadow a plot point if it's either vague enough to not be addressed again, or if I'm almost positive I won't cut it sometime in the future. After you create a story outline, I recommend creating a list of all the story exposition you need to get across to the player. This will help you remember everything you need to include in the plot and help avoid confusing players. While writing the list, try to keep it limited to things you need to explain rather than things you want to explain. For example, you don't need to explain how aspects like magic or future technology work, since most players will simply accept them as magic or future technology and move on. You do, on the other hand, need to explain things like the motivations of each character, because otherwise they'll seem very one-dimensional and unrealistic. Other than this, I would also add any plot points to the list that seem like they're only occurring thanks to random circumstances. An example of this would be a scene that revolves around a character accidentally finding something important to the plot without even looking for it in the first place. If you want your story to be taken seriously or be realistic, then you should find ways to foreshadow and explain moments like these, because they can easily destroy the player's sense of immersion. Now that you have an idea of what characters will be in your story, a basic outline of it, and a list of exposition you need to include, you can start adding more details to the story outline, like descriptions of cutscenes or story-related events. This is where you'll also want to add or change the story outline to include events that smoothly give exposition or showcase character development. Remember though, when adding plot points, only add ones that feel natural, especially if they're giving the player exposition, advancing the plot, or progressing a character's arc. Also remember to keep the story's pacing intact and to not clash with the gameplay if you're changing plot points. After you've finished refining your story outline, it's time to move on to polishing the core mechanics of your game. To do this, you need to make sure your game has good game feel, which is done by making sure everything in your game, most notably controlling the playable character, feels satisfying and intuitive. While working on how the game feels to play, think back to your character Bible and story outline to determine the tone of the game. Then use this information to decide how the playable character would perform each action. While doing so, ask yourself questions like what the character's facial expression would be, how fast they would move, or what sound effects their actions would trigger. After you've made the playable character's main moveset look and feel good to control, then spend a bit of time refining the game's heads-up display and any other aspects that are essential to the core engine of the game. All other aspects can be tweaked at a later point in the production phase of development, so don't worry about them right now. Once you finish polishing your game's core, you can make a list of potential levels, areas, or worlds you'd like to create. Just in case you have to unexpectedly scrap some levels, it would be smart to have at least 10 or 20 more ideas than the max number you plan on creating. I would also keep adding to the list whenever you think of something. That way, you'll always have a surplus and can also switch out certain ideas if you happen to think of a more favorable one. Speaking of which, when thinking of ideas, refer back to your story outline and see what environments the player-controlled character goes to. This will help you think of more ideas. For example, if the main character is in a snowy environment, it may be a fun idea to make a level based around sliding through ice caves or melting snow monsters. Afterwards, when you're done creating the list, roughly order the levels you've chosen to include in the game and add them to your story outline to create an outline of the entire game. This outline should include descriptions of each level while also listing and describing elements like boss fights or bonus levels, so make sure to add those in as well. Here's a basic example for the outline of a fictional role-playing game. By the way, if you want to use an idea that doesn't quite match up with your story, or if you're simply having trouble thinking of ideas, feel free to go back and change the story outline. Once again, just make sure your story still feels natural and has good pacing. Also, try to make sure you're finished changing the story outline before moving on to the next step. Now that you know which levels you'll be making and have finalized your narrative, it's time to write the entire story out. Some developers might not want to do this all at once and spread out the work, but this often makes the writing process much harder. Writing the story over the span of development often makes the story feel disjointed and forces developers to redo large amounts of work, so I would definitely write out the entire story before continuing. If you're wondering how to actually write it, I would use a screenplay or script format, but it's ultimately up to you. A screenplay format looks something like this, and in my opinion, it's the easiest way to read or write a story that's going to be translated into a visual medium. This is because the format makes it easy for voice actors to read and also allows you to include visual descriptions in a short and sweet manner. Of course, feel free to not adhere to a single format as long as it's easy to understand by anyone reading it and isn't needlessly long or unorganized. I say this not only because other people may read it, but also because if it's too disorganized, you may have trouble understanding it in the far future. The next step in planning a game is to create a debug mode. Many developers consider these modes completely optional, but personally I consider them essential to planning games. A debug mode is a kind of cheating system that is usually activated by a command only developers know. This system makes it easier for developers to quickly edit or create levels. Most devs do this by programming in secret commands that activate abilities or change attributes of the game. These abilities can include anything you'd like, so feel free to add whatever you think would make your job easier. Here's a short list of abilities you may want to add. One ability I would highly recommend every game developer add to their debug mode is the ability to view statistics about each element. Technical, number-based statistics like frames per second counters and player coordinates can be useful for testing and bug fixing. Although, less traditional statistics can be useful as well. Displaying the hitboxes of enemies or lines that show the player's max jump arc can help tremendously when it comes to testing and designing your game. When you've finished your debug mode, it's time to plan your game's introduction. For the sake of getting as much information across as possible, and making this already long video as short as possible, let's just say your game's intro is comprised of a cutscene, a level, and a boss. I recommend to always start by planning the level itself, regardless of whether or not it's for the game's intro. So in order to plan the intro level and all other levels, you'll have to refer back to what your game's outline says about its environment, tone, difficulty, starting location, and ending location. Then create a design document based around all this information and the statistics from your debug mode. This document should show a rough draft of the level map and include any necessary notes, like enemy movement patterns, how certain objects interact with others, and the optimal way to play through the level. Luckily, no matter what type of game you're making, you can create a design document in any way you'd like, with any medium, whether it be physical or digital. Many developers, myself included, like to draw out their levels on graph paper. Others think outside the box and create models of levels out of Lego bricks. This is a method Hideo Kojima, the creator of the Metal Gear series, has used to plan out levels in the past. Personally, I wouldn't recommend this or any other physical method as it can quickly get very expensive, become incredibly time-consuming, or take up large amounts of space, especially if you don't want to deconstruct it. If you do make something physical though, make sure to take multiple pictures of it just in case you have to disassemble it or if it breaks. One last method I don't recommend is to use your debug mode as one big design document. Take it from someone who's done this in the past. Use a different method that doesn't involve programming every single idea onto the screen. That way, you won't do any unnecessary work just to end up scrapping or changing it every time you have second thoughts. Once you've planned the intro level, you can now plan the intro boss. This task is fairly simple and is basically just like planning out a more complicated enemy. All you have to do to plan any boss is create a design document that includes any notes you deem necessary on how the boss works. I would include details about how the boss attacks, list how much damage the boss can give or take, describe how the player can damage it, draw out its movement patterns, and map the fight's arena. Remember to refer back to your game's outline again so you know when and where this fight takes place. That'll help you with tasks like designing its arena, gauging its difficulty, and deciding on its theme. After you've planned every other aspect in the intro, all that's left is to plan its cutscene. So to plan the intro cutscene, and all other cutscenes for that matter, take the information you have from your game's outline and create storyboards for the scene. Storyboards are a sequence of very rough drawings or sketches that represent each of the camera angles and actions in a scene. These contain notes, like text explaining the actions of characters and arrows depicting either the camera or character's movement. They're very useful for planning out camera shots, showing how a character acts, and most importantly, making sure the cutscene is interesting and dynamic. I would do this for every scene, but make sure to at least choreograph or plan out the character actions in fight scenes, as they can seem very odd and boring if you just make them up as you go along. When you finish the storyboards, some of you may want to storyboard every cutscene at roughly the same time before doing anything else. If you have a small number of cutscenes or they're each very simple, then go ahead and storyboard them all in a row. But if not, I would recommend breaking them up into chunks just in case something changes later on. For example, maybe only storyboard the cutscenes of the first area or world before moving on to the next. Both of these methods are fine, and it's basically down to your personal preference if you don't care about possibly redoing storyboards. Just make sure to refresh your memory on the other cutscenes you've storyboarded if you decide to break up the process. That way, you won't forget what shots and movements you've already storyboarded in other cutscenes, and you can keep character actions consistent. Finally, you're almost ready to exit the pre-production phase. Just revise all the work you've done so far one last time, and then you can enter the production phase of development. But don't get too excited, because there's still plenty of planning to be done in the next stage. Luckily, this time you'll be able to alternate between planning a segment of the game and actually creating it. Just plan all the aspects of a segment, like cutscenes, levels, and bosses, then make all the assets you need and actually create it. Then plan the next segment, then create the next segment, and so on until you finish everything. The pre-production phase may be tedious and a large amount of extra work, but trust me, if you get into the habit of planning everything out before creating your game, or any medium for that matter, it'll be far more focused, easier to develop, and better designed than what you would have created if you just made everything up as you went along. I've been Supersonic 7C, and I'll see you guys next time.